Morning, everybody. Bow to the Buddha 3 times to show our respect. First bow. Eyes. Second bow. Eyes. Third bow. Eyes. Half bow. Amida. Please be seated. Again, if you make sure you're sitting comfortably, either half lotus flower or left leg over right thigh or right thigh over left leg. Of course, the proper way to sit is the full lotus flower. It helps to distribute the weight evenly. Okay, make yourself feel comfortable. Right hand over left palm, thumbs slightly joint. Back straight, elbows out. Head tilted downwards. Eyes open, look forward, downwards. Breathe in and out. Breathe in and out. One more time. Breathe in and out. Visualize and understand that the physical body is sitting here. Visualize impermanence. One day, the body will grow old, it will die. The bones and flesh will be separated, and everything will fly into dust. The wind blows through and takes it all away. There is nothing left remaining. "假如能做双盘，当然很好。不能双盘做也没关系，只要身体感觉舒服就好。重点就是腰部要直而自然，保持身体柔软但不动。观想身体无常，一天身体会变老、生病和死亡。肌肉及骨骼会分离及腐朽，最后慢慢变成灰尘。风一吹，灰尘就被吹得无影无踪。到底没有什么值得执着。Back straight, elbows out. Breathe in, you know you're breathing in. Breathe out, you know you're breathing out. 安住呼吸，安住佛号。吸入时就知道自己在吸气，呼出时就知道自己在呼气。 Breathe in, you know you're breathing in. Breathe out, breathing out. Breathe in all the positive energy. Breathe out all the stress and stress from your feet, knees, your thighs, lower back, upper back, elbows, shoulders, neck. Breathe out all the stress and tension. What is left? Your comfort. Drop your shoulder. In your posture, drop your body flexible but immovable. An住呼吸，住佛号。腰部要直和自然。背 elbows out。 Breathe in, you know you're breathing in. Breathe out, you know you're breathing out. Breathe in, your heart is filled with joy and gratitude. Wish to radiate that joy towards yourself, family and friends, neutral persons, foes and enemies, and all sentient beings. In this way, you are concentrated. Blurry vision, eyes open, bring yourself in.安住呼吸，安住佛，生来维持觉醒的正念。 elbows.呼吸，舒服。Of back.腰部要直而自然。Maintain awareness of your breathing.是正念。 Elbows out.呼吸，舒服。You may release your meditation. Rotate your wrists. Rub your arms, your feet, your knees, your thighs. Continue to maintain awareness of your breathing. 继续安住呼吸，安住佛号。Let go of your legs. You should remain sitting until you completely recover normal sensations, your feet and legs. Okay, if you have completely recovered your normal sensations and you feel fine, slowly rise, and we will bow to the Buddha 3 times to show our respect, and we'll continue with the lecture. Bow. Eyes. Bow. Eyes. Third bow. Eyes. Back in a All right, if you could all please rise, face Buddha image, and please join your palms. Together we recite 3 times. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. Namo Shakyamuni Buddha. The unsurpassed, profound, and wonderful Dharma is difficult to encounter in hundreds of millions of eons. I now see and hear it, receive and uphold it, and I vow to fathom the Tathagata's true meaning. All right, this is where we are in the Amida Sutra, the native direction, and we've been discussing the Lion Buddha, which represents strength and confidence in propagating the truth. And that takes us to the 3 jewels, and we have been talking about the Dharma jewels. In the Dharma jewels, the last part that I would like to share with you is the reality that the Buddha attained. That includes the different elements of reality, include dukkha, impermanence, and then we've been talking about the true mind. And so let's jump to where to that. So we've talked about the delusions of the mind, which essentially is sense consciousness, and there are several elements in that. The first sense consciousness is essentially the 6th sense, the mind, the differentiation, ability to recognize, and the Buddha said to Ananda that is illusion. So we talked about that. And what we have been, what we left off last time was about the ego, the 7th sense. Okay, so that's which is the 7th consciousness. And the Buddha says here is that it is also unreal. So 7th sense here, 7th sense is the ego. 7th sense is which represents the ego or the subconsciousness. And here, this is how the Buddha explains to Ananda. Okay, he said that even if you succeeded in putting the end of all seeing, hearing, feeling, and knowing, and so preserve the inner quiet, the shadow of your differentiation of things, a Dharma, a phenomena, still remains. So last time the Buddha talked about how the Ananda thought that the Buddha tested Ananda where his mind was, and he said that it was in his seeing. And then the Buddha says, well, where is that seeing? And he gave 7 different scenarios, and the Buddha discarded them all. And so Ananda thought that his seeing, his ability to see, was in his eyes, or the ability of hearing was in his ears. So the eyes, the ears, the tongue, those are just sensors. And so the Buddha said that those arguments are groundless. And here, the Buddha says here that even if you have succeeded in recognizing the delusion of it and the true nature of it, there is still the 7th sense that we have to overcome in order to break away from the cycle of life and death. And that is the 7th sense, which is the ego. The ego is what's keeping us in the samsara, the cycle of life and death. And the Buddha continues, I do not want you to hold that this is not mine. So in other words, even though the seeing, the hearing, the sense consciousness, the 6th sense is delusional, it doesn't mean that it does not exist. Even in the absence of sense, data is really your mind. In other words, even though the 7th sense, the 6th sense arises, the 6th consciousness arises because of its interaction of the sensors, the organs interacting with sense data, objects, environment. And as long as, and during interaction that the sixth sense arises, lacking those criteria, there is no sense consciousness. But here the Buddha wants us to avoid thinking that there is nothing. Just because there's no sense data, there is nothing. That is not how the Buddha wants us to understand this. So even though it arises because of conditions and it goes away because of condition, doesn't mean that it does not exist. There is no annihilation. There is no existentialism. So for they are not permanent, and when they stop to exist. So if your Dharmakaya, which is the Dharmakaya here represents the Dharma body of a being, a person who has achieved enlightenment like the Buddha, can so easily stop to be, who will then practice, realize the patient endurance of uncreate. What this means that if there is nothing really to achieve, you putting all your efforts, then there is no value in that practice. So let me explain that a little bit more. Okay, so although the consciousness arises based on conditions, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Right? If it stops to exist because there's no sense data, then that is equivalent to nihilism. Extinction, which is an extreme that the Buddha rejects. So there are two extremes: annihilation, and the other one is existentialism. So the other extreme is existentialism, which Ananda has mistakenly taken his sense consciousness to be an unchanging self. And so he says to the Buddha, I found your 32 great marks to be magnificent, and in my aberration that I became a monk. If I didn't become a monk, or I slandered the Dharma, it would come from the same mind. So the Nanda was confused because he thought that it was his sense consciousness was his, because whether he adored the Buddha's great marks, beauties, or he ended up slandering the Dharma, it would be the same mind. The Buddha replies, your admiration came from your sense perceptions, right? His eyes interact with the objects, causing rise to sense consciousness, that's sense perceptions. So it is not your true self. Your eyes saw my 32 great marks, and you caused rise to admiration and became a monk to search for spiritual liberation. So in other words, your search for liberation was motivated externally. So the Buddha says, what if I grow old and my skin has wrinkles and my hair is now gray and my appearances have degraded physically? So would your admiration be degraded along with it as well? So if Ananda is basing his admiration on an external object, then if that object rises, if the object is beautiful, then he casts rises to admiration. But if that object degrades and is no longer valuable, then by definition, his admiration would decline as well. So in a way, we are very much like Ananda, right? We should ask ourselves, why are we interested in Buddhism? And if you ask this question, people may say, well, because it brings me peace and happiness, or because my good friends, I happen to follow my good friends, they study Buddhism, I think it's cool, and therefore I study Buddhism with them, or because the Dharma teacher is wonderful, so I follow that teacher because I find him to be such a wonderful person. So this kind of interest in studying Buddhism is fragile and it's conditional because it's based on external conditions. It's not based on our own motivation. Because when we encounter difficulties, whether in life or at work, at home, we can no longer hold on to our joy and happiness, then we will lose interest in studying Buddhism because it's no longer satisfying the needs that we projected externally. And so when we see our good friends giving up studying Buddhism, then we will give up as well because our interest was based on our friends' interest. So if our friends are no longer studying Buddhism, then of course we will stop studying Buddhism as well. Or when we see the Dharma teachers with human flaws, then we will give up pursuing spiritual liberation too because our Dharma teacher is not as perfect as we thought. So in other words, our motivation is based on external environment. So when one is externally motivated, one is only borrowing the external conditions to progress, to make progress. And of course, this is unreliable because what you have borrowed is not yours. Right? If we are basing our motivation because of our friends, because of external environments, then that's not our own. We are only borrowing from our friends and external environment. Just for example, if you have a credit card and you have $100,000 in credit limit, right? You can spend up to $100,000. Doesn't mean that your wealth is worth $100,000. Your credit limit is $100,000. Doesn't mean you truly have $100,000. Of course, if you spend whatever you spent on that credit card, you have to pay back because it's not your own money. But if it was your own money, then you wouldn't have to pay anything back. Whatever you spent, you spent. So when the conditions are no longer there, one will be spiritually lost. Right? If our motivation was not originated from the proper location, then of course it will fluctuate according to conditions. So this is why people give up even after decades of practice. So this is why the Buddha told Ananda, your sense perceptions will not get you to ultimate enlightenment. And even though your sense perception is not real, it doesn't mean that there's nothing there and that it will stop to exist because there's no sense data. And this is something, there is something to realize in the patience, endurance of uncreated, which is a state of deathless, if you will. So you become attached to it, to that sense perception, taking it to be your permanent true self, then that is false. If not, then it is not false. So the Buddha is reassuring Nanda that he is not some inanimated object, no mind, no perceptions, so that he said that you are not a lifeless thing like dirt and lumber. So, right? So that's what the Buddha is trying to explain to Ananda, that by cleaning his, from a commentary, cleaning the mind which he mistook for his true mind, and taught them how to develop the Buddha taught them, the monks, how to create, developed non-creating mind. And then the Buddha reassured him and wiped out his perplexity, saying that, why do you think you are a lifeless thing? Because Ananda thought that he had no mind, no consciousness, because the Buddha told him that whatever consciousness that he had was not real. Okay. All right. Are there any comments so far? Is it clear so far? Give you a quick moment to digest that. Okay. And here's in the commentary, if it was true mind, it should have nature of its own even after sense data have stopped to exist. So if that sense perception was really true, then it should, right, it should maintain its existence even with or without sense data. It should be independent of sense data. Since it is not more, it is no more when there is no sense data, then isn't it false, right? So as you listen, the Buddha addressed Ananda and assembly, as you listen to my sermon on the Dharma, you differentiate solely because of my voice. But when I stop speaking, your mind, this mind of yours will stop to exist. So when we listen, that is hearing, consciousness. And when there is silence, then we don't hear that voice anymore. But it doesn't mean that there is nothing there. But that sense consciousness is not permanent because it arises and it falls based on sense data. Okay, let me see if I missed anything. So sense perception is false and not true mind. Otherwise, it would need sense object to come into existence. So the Buddha says that you have hearing consciousness because of my voice, and when I stop speaking, you can no longer hear, but it doesn't mean that your hearing ability has become extinct. But that ability exists conditionally. So understanding conditionality is proper. Clinging to nihilism or existentialism is delusional. Right? So the seventh consciousness here, which grabs at the innermost self of an ego. So the sense consciousness that we can sense, we can really sense. If we listen, we can see that we're differentiating, we recognize, so that we can sense. But the seventh consciousness is even deeper. It is our subconsciousness that we are not aware of normally. Unless you have meditated mind, that your mind is pure, you cannot easily detect it. And that is precisely the root of birth and death. So it is because our ego attachment that we have created this cycle of life for it, because its desire to exist, to survive in it, and therefore the conditions exist for its existence. And the fourth aggregate, samskara, and so wiped out the seventh consciousness. So the fourth aggregate here is volition. Remove this. So in terms of remember the five aggregates, the four aggregates is volition, and that's the ego. That is your subconsciousness. Okay. We should recognize that until we attain the state of no self, we will continue to be attached to our own ego. This is self-attachment. The ego makes a person think that his self, his being, truly exists on its own, and that it is unique from other people's self, ego. And it makes a person feel important because the ego that the world is centered around us, and it makes us feel important. But because of this wrong view that sentient beings become selfish, they have selfishness, and that they create karma that continues to bind them in the cycle of life and death. For example, because we have a self, when other criticize us, we get upset. Or when people compliment us, we feel happy. Right? If they do us wrong, we feel violated and feel upset. We feel as if we are being violated. For example, if somebody is criticizing our work, the project we put in, right? We're burning midnight oil to finish it, and then the following morning we present our project to our boss or to a team, and they criticize us. They criticize the project, but we feel violated because we have that attachment to our project, and therefore we feel as if we ourselves are being violated, are being offended. And so therefore it leads us to protecting the self, ourself. So anything that conflicts with the self, it causes rise to anger. And anything that is suiting to us, it forms attachment. It forms desire, wanting to have more of it. So the self is the cause for unskillful karma. Because of this self that we have created so much
unskillful karma, selfishness, jealousy, all in the name of the ego in order to defend it. And therefore, because of our unskillful karma, that we continue to become enslaved in the samsara. We cannot break away from it. So and the more powerful and smarter a person is, the tendency is that that person becomes arrogant, and therefore the bigger the ego. As a young child, the ego is small, right? Because that child sees himself or herself as insignificant. And so therefore, the ego is small. The more significant, the more important we see of ourselves, the bigger the ego. And as that child grows older and now has and attains power and positions in society or at work, then he begins to see himself as being very important, and that easily can lead to arrogance. And of course, the ego is inflated because of that arrogance. And that is delusional. It leads to delusions. Because that person will prone to mistakes and unskillful Dharma, creating all those unskillful Dharma, all in the name of the ego. And of course, with unskillful karma, it just brings sufferings to himself. So we should recognize that the ego is delusional. And whether we should understand the Buddhist principles. When we understand the Buddhist principles, we will minimize the ego, and that helps to avoid mistakes. And we do things to defend the ego, it just leads to selfishness and mistakes. So those who don't understand the principles or the Dharma cannot truly differentiate between skillfulness and unskillfulness. And they continue to chase after emotions and old habits. If they are angry, they want revenge. Right? If they are joyful, they want to have more of it. And if somebody takes that joy away from them, they become angry. So their lives are emotionally based. So when they do skillful deeds, they don't know that those are merits. And when they do unskillful deeds, they don't even know that those are the seeds of suffering. So to them, merits and faults or sins are indistinguishable. And there is no wisdom in that. It's all emotions. So this principle of no self is important, because no matter how diligent our practice is, we can spend 10 hours a day reading the scriptures or meditate 10 hours a day, but without understanding the no-self principle, we are still on the outside of the fence. We have not yet entered the gates. Right? We have not really put our feet into the grounds of Buddhism. So although we are still delusional, but we should feel fortunate enough to have wise and compassionate gurus or teachers to help us to achieve something beautiful and meaningful in our lives. Right? They teach us those beautiful principles, and they make our lives more illuminating. And we now have some control over our lives and some control of our afflictions, and not have our worries, anxieties, afflictions go haywire. So because of our understanding of the principles and their teachings, that we are no longer returning to our old habits and unskillful self-centered behavior. So as a result, we have elevated our standards of being. We are no longer accepting the mundaneness as something that is worth living by. So although we may still be egoistic, delusional, we still have self-attachment. This is something very difficult to break away, but at least our hearts are filled with great and beautiful principles and full of hope. Right? So in other words, by learning these principles, by trying our best to practice the Dharma, we have opened the doors to something greater than mundaneness. So in this virtual lecture hall, right? Studying the Dharma together, we are trying to rise above the mundane level of greed, anger, and jealousy, which is something that is very common in the world. And these principles allow us to have the courage and the wisdom to get over to the shore of enlightenment. Right? We have great teachers like the Buddha and wonderful gurus and teachers. They have done, they practice, and they put in their heart and soul into the practice, and they have achieved something great. And that is giving us a lot of encouragement that by studying this, by following the same footsteps, that we will be able to achieve something great as well. Okay. And that's the fourth aggregate, which is the ego. And the Buddha continues that the fourth aggregate is false thinking. So let's do that. So when we study the Dharma, it leads to right and proper thinking. The proper thinking here is that in this proper thinking, or in the Dharma, the realms of the Dharma, the principles, the more that one achieves, it brings joy to ourselves and others. For example, the four immeasurables. Right? Well, the third immeasurable is sympathetic joy. When we see other people have achieved something great, we have joy arising in our hearts as well. And it may lead to skillful competition and encouragement. Whereas the improper thinking, which is normal in the world, the more that one achieves, it brings jealousy, and unhealthy competition over physical power. It brings unhealthy joy that encourages arrogance. And it brings jealousy and unhealthy competition over physical power in others. And that eventually leads to destruction. Because in the struggle of physical power, as long as I have more than you, then I feel secure. If I have less than you, then I don't feel secure. And so that motivates the other person to try to have more. Right? My $1 million is not enough. Right? You have $2 million, I have to be more than you in order to be number one. Otherwise, I will not feel safe in that realm of competition. Unlike in the Dharma, where the more that the other person achieves, it causes rise to true joy. Of course, it doesn't mean that as a Buddhist we should fear competition and challenges. As long competition is healthy and it should be encouraged as long as it elevates our standards and avoid complacence. Right? This is called diligence, right diligence, where we always put in our best effort to do the best we can. And as a result, it drives towards improvements. So we should do the right things and do the best that we can for the greater good. Okay. So that's the difference between false thinking and proper thinking, right? Proper thinking, again, leads to improvement, leads to greatness. False thinking leads to jealousy, or the negative emotions, and unhealthy competition. So Buddha says that who will practice and realize the patient endurance of the uncreate, which is a very sublime realm, is that, well, if there's nothing at all, then what is what's the value in practicing Buddhism if there's nothing at all? Okay, so let me zoom this in. So although there's nothing to be had, it doesn't mean that it does not exist. So therefore, we should avoid, oops, sorry about that. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and we should avoid the two extremes. Right? One extreme is that things don't exist, that they will extinct and therefore there's nothing at all. And the other is that it lasts forever. If it doesn't exist, if there's really nothing at all, then there's really no value in studying Buddhism. So something has value only because it is needed and that it brings benefits. So working our way towards Buddhism has value because we want to break away from the suffering of birth, old age, illness, and death. And so therefore, to us, it's value because it's a tool for us to overcome those sufferings. But to a Buddha who has already achieved complete liberations from afflictions, has really no use for the Dharma because he has already achieved it. But his eons of effort toward Buddhahood are not meaningless. Right? He's put in a lot of effort, but the result doesn't mean that it does not exist and that it's meaningless. So he's still using the Dharma to help sentient beings, although he doesn't need it any longer, but it is still valuable to sentient beings. So Buddhism is like medicine. Its value is in curing diseases. Right? A person who is not sick would not find medicine to be very useful because he doesn't need it. An enlightened person has no more to gain from the Dharma because he has already achieved enlightenment. But it doesn't mean that Dharma is any less valuable. So from the perspective of deluded sentient beings, the Dharma is extremely valuable. And it is our compassion of Buddhas that they protect and propagate the Dharma to end all afflictions and sufferings of sentient beings. So while we are still mundane beings, we should understand the value of Buddhism and utilize it to reach liberations and end afflictions for ourselves and others. So at the same time, we protect the Dharma, our compassion for others, not to make us feel better about ourselves with people following us. We should not try to convert people, because in that conversion is to eliminate our own fear. We convert people because of our own fear, then that is not proper. But if we share the Dharma with other people out of compassion, then that is proper. Well, what that means is we must have already realized some fruit of the Dharma in order to share something that's wonderful. Otherwise, we are sharing something that is empty inside. So if we only protect the Dharma without understanding it, and without understanding its value and making it part of our lives, then it is like a bank teller counting money all day, right? But he is still not wealthy because he's counting other people's money and not his own money. Likewise, when we study the Dharma and our lives are still being controlled by afflictions and full of anxieties, then we are not spiritually wealthy. It is because none of what we have learned is our own wealth. In other words, we would just be paying lip service to Buddhism. So one is reaping the benefits from studying Buddhism should mean that the more one studies and practices Buddhism, one should feel more spiritually wealthy. In other words, less fear, less affliction, less emotional attachment, and yet more compassionate and helpful, and more righteous and honest. That's where spiritual wealth is that we have more compassion. But in order to truly give something that's valuable, we must already have that something that's valuable. So if we truly want to share the Dharma and to express our compassion, then that means we must first reap the loving kindness for ourselves. Okay. So that's the benefits of practicing Buddhism. Here the Buddha says, practicing students, jhana cannot step out of the stream of transmigration, and so fail to become arahats, clinging to the samsaric false thinking, and mistaking for reality. So here the Buddha is saying that even if we practice meditation alone, jhana, it is not enough to break that cycle of life and death. And let's see why that is. Okay, jhana alone is not enough to help to liberate one from the cycle of life and death, but it's really wisdom. Wisdom is what allows a person to break the cycle of life and death, to recognize that no longer create the conditions for the cycle of life and death, but to create the conditions for liberation. So wisdom cannot be attained without meditative mind. And precepts and morality and ethics, all those things support the development of the meditative mind. So that brings us to called the virtuous cycle of 3 studies. And the 3 studies are the precepts, morality, meditation, jhana, and wisdom. So in his book, Shankaracita uses an analogy of the 3 studies. Precepts and morality are like a launch pad of rockets, or a rocket. And jhana is like flying high into the atmosphere. And wisdom is out into space, escaping Earth's gravitational pull. So once in space, the rocket is free from the pull of the Earth's gravity. And as long as it's still within Earth's atmosphere, it will be pulled back to Earth when the propulsion stops. So what that means is, this is why sometimes one loses interest in Buddhism and that his diligence wavers. And sometimes sometimes one feels committed and energetic about studying Buddhism. At other times, one feels spiritually lethargic. And of course, one should understand the source of that discouragement. It could be a past karma that's weighing us down, could be the existing environment that may not be so healthy in encouraging us, or it could be our current affliction, our current thinking that putting a negative spin on it, that we don't see the benefits, we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And it could be any combination of the 3. It could be primarily our past karma, or it just the existing environment are so unhealthy that it overshadows our good roots and even our positive thinking. Or it could be all 3. And of course, we should continue to try our best. The best is not to allow it to weigh us down, but because we don't know which one is weighing us down, the best that we can do for ourselves is to continue our best, stay the course, and not let discouragement weigh us down. Life has its own inertia, right? The law of inertia is that it will continue in its direction until an external force acts on it. So if we find ourselves in this continuous negative thinking, for example, then our life is not going to be any brighter in the future. So in order to change that, we have to instill some positive thinking, some helpful and healthy environment, and do good deeds to overcome our past negative karma. So we don't know exactly which, therefore we should try our best by giving it the right conditions to change, because without giving the right conditions, without that external force acting on it, it's likely that we can continue in the same direction. So this is why the Buddha says that jhana alone is not, because in jhana, a practitioner is only suppressing his afflictions. He is not arising to wisdom to see things clearly. The analogy that's often used in commentaries is like in jhana, it's like a rock that is suppressing the grass. So the grass cannot grow momentarily, but the roots are still there. So when a person loses that meditative ability or the rock being lifted, then of course the grass with the roots will find its way to life again. And that is because of the attachment to this samsaric false thinking. Okay. Okay. So here the Buddha continues here during the lecture, the sermon. After hearing this, Ananda, in bitter tears, prostrated himself with his head, knees, and elbows on the ground, palms together, and said to the Buddha, "I merely rely on his transcendental power, and that I could dispense with practice." So he thought that because he was the half brother of the Buddha, that the Buddha would surely save him and make him an arhat. Okay. So of course, from this, Ananda is teaching us a lesson here that he has learned. And the lessons here is that we should put in our earnest diligence to practice Buddhism. Okay, it's good to have help. It's good that we have gurus and teachers, wonderful teachers to share with us, but we should not become complacent thinking that they will do the heavy lifting for us. We have to do our own lifting. But we should always check our intentions. Why do we want to study Buddhism? What do we want to get out of it? If we don't understand our motive, truly, what's really lying behind that motivation, and it's going to be very difficult for us to make progress. So we should understand our intentions. Otherwise, there will be no stability in our progress. Right? We should put our heart and soul into it, studying Buddhism, in order to maintain that enthusiasm and stability. Just an example here. So for example, a couple months ago, right, when the COVID-19 pandemic, the disease was at its peak, and we got all scared, thinking that we too may get infected and die in isolation, because the numbers of cases kept increasing daily, and we thought that it could get us sooner or later. So we turned for Pure Land practitioners. As Pure Land practitioners, we turned to the Amitabha Buddha for salvation. And then we started to have a little, of dry cough, and even we felt a little bit a headache and some nervousness. And when we took our blood pressure, and it was oddly higher than normal. So we're thinking, this is it. Our time has come, and we regret it and thought that we shouldn't have made that trip last week to Costco to get more toilet paper. And we thought that we may have gotten infected while joining a crowd to get that remaining bags of rice, thinking that, well, in case it got worse, that the country was going to go under a complete lockdown, that would be covered. And so at that moment, we were scared. We're thinking that our time has come. And so we keep diligently chanting Amitabha, just in case that it turns out that it is truly that we have been infected and that we'll have to die alone. At least Amitabha would come to escort us to the Western Pure Land. And so we continue with the diligence. Weeks have gone by and we're still breathing. We're still kicking. We're still walking around as normal. And the headache seems to have gotten better. The blood pressure seems to have returned to normal. And it is now certain that we're not going to die anytime soon, and that Amitabha won't be coming to escort us any minute now, right? And the country seems to be lifting its restrictions, things to be moving back to normal slowly, And so we're returning to our busy life of work and family, and we're beginning to be less mindful of Amitabha and even skip studying Buddhism. So in other words, there is no stability in our progress because there was no real diligence coming from within us. We were only reacting to the situations. We got scared because of the situation, therefore we were diligent. But that diligence and progress were only momentary. Right? To make long-lasting progress, we should maintain some sort of diligence constantly. It shouldn't be in the time of disasters that we practice Buddhism, or we are mindful of Amitabha, or that we are now diligent in our practice. But that diligence should be daily, should be part of our lives, and not situational. So if it is situational, then of course we will be very diligent shortly, but then it will not last. And that is not reliable. And so that's the Buddha, the Ananda here is saying, well, I was being very complacent, thinking that the Buddha would help me. I don't have to do my own lifting. So he bestows samadhi, that the Buddha would bestow samadhi upon me, Adana, and I did not know that he could not be my substitute. So he lost sight of his fundamental mind. Okay. Okay. So Ananda was being complacent and arrogant in a way, thinking that by being the Buddha's half-brother, that the Buddha would surely make him an arhat, right, to be liberated from the cycle of life and death. So in the face of COVID-19 disease, this situation, this dire situation, it brings fear and anxiety. People, of course, naturally people will react, and therefore thinking that there might be a shutdown, a complete shutdown, and so they stock up a lot of foods at home for fear of running out of food. But it's been months now, right? The inventory levels, last time I checked in the supermarkets, seem to have returned to its normalcy. So there are no signs of running out of food. This is false perceptions or false mind. So we should understand that if we don't have the condition for starvation, then we won't encounter starvation. In other words, if we practice giving, practice sharing what we have with others, whether sharing knowledge, sharing fearlessness, giving fearlessness, or giving wealth, internal wealth like your time that you put into volunteer, or external wealth like your money, physical possessions. When we practice giving, we are creating conditions for fullness. So there shouldn't be any fear in running out of food because we practice giving, right? Assuming that you have been practice giving, and you can find out whether you've been giving is that how do you react when you give? Do you give grudgingly, right? Or do you give because somebody's forcing you to give, or you happily, joyfully give to share with others because you want others to alleviate the suffering? So you have that joy, that natural joy. That means that it's the momentum of giving that has already been in the past. And so there should be not any fear of running out of food if you continue to practice giving. You practice sharing with others, then you don't have the conditions for starvation, right? In fact, you create the conditions for sufficiency. You will always have enough. So understanding the law of conditionality is very helpful because it allows us to see things clearly, and it reassures us that things will be okay because we have not created the conditions for starvation. So we shouldn't have any fear of starving. Okay. And Ananda says here that because he lost his sight of his fundamental mind, that he was unable to enter the Tao. The Tao is literally the way or the truth. It's a translation from Chinese Tao. I was like a destitute, like a homeless person, running away from my own wealthy family, right? Despite of much listening to the Dharma, Ananda was the Buddha's personal attendant, and so wherever the Buddha went, he would be there to serve the Buddha, and as a result, he was foremost in hearing the Dharma. But of course, he was just counting the Buddha's wealth. He was not counting his own wealth, like the banker. And because of that even though he had listened to the Dharma a lot, but he did not put into practice. So therefore, he was not able to satisfy his own anger by merely listening to the food. Speaking of food, so because you're hungry and you're not eating, and of course you're not going to satisfy the hunger. It's only through eating that you can satisfy the hunger. You can dream, right, of all the foods, the wonderful taste, but unless you eat the food, your body will still be hungry. So in other words, we can read the scriptures, all the scriptures, but until we put into practice, until we make that as our lives, we will not be able to reap much benefits of it. It will only be interesting. Okay, so stay focused, continue the course of Buddhism, whether it's in favorable or unfavorable situations, and we have unwavering focus and determination, and that leads to reduction of fear because we know what we're doing, we know who we are, we know what we want, so we are not distracted by external environments. Those distractions don't dissuade us from pursuing our goal, and therefore we get closer to a true mind because we are not distracted by those distractions. Okay, and because I'm caught by the two hindrances because I do not know the real nature. So may the Tathagatas or the Buddha be compassionate enough to fully reveal to me this wondrous, bright mind. So Ananda has realized his mistakes of just listening to the Dharma, but not putting into practice. So here the Buddha is explaining to Ananda, a moment ago, you said that you saw my shining fist, right? My fist, that the Buddha raised the fist, and Ananda said, yes, yes, I can see your fist. And so the Buddha says, well, how did its brightness come about? Meaning the fist, the shining fist that the Buddha was holding up. What caused it to take the form of a fist? And what do you see in it? What do you see it? What do you use to see the fist? No? Okay. And here, just in the commentary, the true mind is not true because the perception is conditional. And so since the sense organ and consciousness depend on each other, this is the field of wrong thinking. So his Ananda's original perceptions of the Buddha's 32 great marks and 80 beauties was false consciousness because it was the result of his sense organs, the eyes, interacting with the sense object, the Buddha's adorned appearances. So Ananda's motivation for spiritual liberation came from the false sense perception, not from his own within. So he was only conditionally motivated, because hadn't he realized the Buddha's great beauty, he would have not left home to search for the truth. So the problem is the problem of being in the samsara, the cycle of life and death, is not the sense organs, nor is it the sense data, nor is the sense consciousness. The problem really resides in the sensation. Right? When it is in that reaction that causes rise to positive and negative form of attachment, and not understanding conditionality during interaction. When our organs interact with sense data, we cause rise to sensations, either hatred, either joy, suffering, or no joy, no suffering, and that leads to either aversion with hatred or attachment with joy. Then that's where it motivates us to create karma, and that's what locks us in. So there is nothing wrong with our sense organs. Your eyes, we still have eyes. We can use our eyes to read the sutras, right? And we can use the sutra to help us with understanding that will help us to mold our sense consciousness so that it can be better. So there is nothing wrong with our sense organs nor the sense data. The environment, it is what it is. There's nothing wrong with the environment. What it is wrong is we become attached to it. We cause rise to these emotions that drive us to create karma. Negative karma, even positive karma. It is still within the samsara, the cycle of life and death. So that is wrong thinking. Wrong thinking was originally the great wisdom light of the true mind in the Tathagatas or the Buddha. Tathagata store here, I guess the thinking here is that for the true mind, it represents the true mind, which under delusion turned into false thinking, and so transformed this wisdom light into false seeing. So it is so again, it is not with the sense organs or the sense data or sense consciousness, but what we should fear is deluded sense consciousness. Just because sense data is not true mind, it doesn't mean that it has no value and it should be discarded. Right? So that sense consciousness is a tool. We can use a tool to help, to build, to construct, or we can use that same tool to destroy. However, because of the sense consciousness, that one is deluded. But it is also because of the sense consciousness that one is heading towards enlightenment. And for example, when the sensation, when we interact with objects and it causes rise to sensation, and that sensation happens to, if we don't have any control of it, it naturally will lead to attachment when it encounters joy. And of course, that just leads to continues, right, that cycle of life and death. And then in the sensation, in that interaction that we see conditionality, then it leads to liberation, spiritual liberation. Because we understand why things happen, and that does not, like somebody slanders us, somebody criticizes us, we understand the conditions, why things happened. Therefore, we don't react in a negative way. And therefore, we don't generate negative karma, which will only lead to more suffering in the future. So, under delusion, it creates false thinking, taking false sense consciousness for something to be true. We are attached to our sense consciousness. We are attached to, we think that we have the self, the ego, that exists on its own, and that makes us feel important because we feel that there is an existence in us and that it needs to be protected. And that will only lead to selfish craving, self-centeredness. Okay? Is that clear so far? Any comments? Give you a quick second to absorb that. Okay, all right, we will continue. So then Ananda replies here that, so the Buddha was asking Ananda, what did you use to see my fist? And Ananda replied, well, it was really my eyes that saw Buddha's fist and his fingers. And the Buddha says, using example analogies, say, if I had no hand, I would have no fist. If you had no eyes, you would have no way of seeing the fist. So is there any connection between your organ of sight and my fist? Ananda says, yes. If I had no eyes, I would have no way of seeing the fist. No faculty of seeing, no. Right? Because Ananda thought that it was his eyes that saw the Buddha's fist. And so the Buddha says, your reasoning is incorrect. Well, it is incorrect because Ananda thinks that it was his flesh eyes that saw the Buddha's fist. And the Buddha gave an example. When you meet a blind man and ask him what he sees, he will tell you that there is nothing but darkness. So things may be screened from view. The faculty of seeing continues. So even though the blind man doesn't see, but the seeing continues, the Buddha says. And here, of course, seeing darkness is still seeing, the Buddha reasons. Ananda says, if a blind man sees nothing, how can this be called seeing? Ananda thinks that it is the eyes that see. And so if a person whose eyes are no longer functional and is blind, then therefore he cannot be seeing anything. That's what Ananda is saying. The Buddha asks, is there any difference between the darkness seen by a blind man and in front of him and that seen by a man who is not blind when he is in the dark room? Like when you're in a dark room, it's completely pitch dark. You cannot see anything. How different is that from your closing your eyes in a lit room? Then Ananda says there's no difference. So for us, on a practical basis, we can avoid being fooled by our own sense consciousness because our understanding can be biased. So how do we know the teachings that we received are proper and consistent with the Buddha's Dharma? Right? We're using our sense consciousness to read scriptures, to view lectures, to attend Dharma talks. But what we're receiving, how do we know that is proper? How do we know that is consistent? Because the Buddha says that sense consciousness is false. We cannot rely on it. So how can we assure ourselves that what we're receiving, what we're understanding is proper? And this is a big concern because we have been apart from the Buddha for more than 2,500 years. That's a long duration away from the true Dharma. But fortunately, there are a few things that we can rely on to help us to determine whether the teachings are trustworthy and consistent with the original intent of the Buddha's Dharma. So first, the teachings should emphasize reverence and respect for the Buddha. Contradictory teachings will lead the practitioner to wrong view. And with a wrong view, a person is prone to making mistakes. Therefore, it can lead to slandering and discrimination. And this will inevitably lead to the disintegration of Buddhism. So the first thing that we should have is utmost reverence. Anybody who is telling us otherwise is not helping us. And the reason is because if we don't have utmost reverence for the Buddha and we have doubt, then we are likely to stray away from Buddhism. And faith in Buddhism, and faith here, I don't mean faith in terms of just believing blindly, but faith in understanding the principles and putting to practice. And with this faith, that we will be more willing to follow the Buddha's footsteps. And then the doors of merits and virtues will open. We will have the courage to practice giving, to express our compassion, and to exercise equality. Therefore, absolute faith in the Buddha is important because it helps us to prevent regressions and giving up. Because if we don't have somebody, if we don't have anybody to look up to, it is very difficult for us to navigate out of this cycle of life and death on our own. If the Buddha did not come to this world, we would not realize that we could achieve complete spiritual liberation. We would not think that would be possible. But because somebody historically did it, 2,500 years ago, more than 2,500 years ago, was able to achieve that, therefore it should give us a lot of hope, motivation that we too can achieve the same thing. The second is that the teaching is consistent with it should be consistent with the law of cause, effect, causality, and conditionality. If the teaching is not consistent with any of those, then it is not reliable. Inconsistent teaching is one that does not encourage responsibility, because essentially law of cause and effect teaches responsibility, where we take responsibility for our own actions. If the teaching is inconsistent when it says hurting others has no consequence, you can kill a lot of people and still have bliss and joy in heaven, for example. Or live like there's no tomorrow. Just go ahead and party without any concerns for tomorrow. Waste your money, your wealth, because we only have one life to live. That is not consistent with Buddhism. Or that there is no morality or ethics. We don't care about morality or ethics. That kind of teaching is not consistent with Buddhism. So proper goal requires proper conditions. Right? To achieve a goal, we need to put in the right efforts and provide the proper conditions. A person who does not observe causality and the conditionality, we should put a big question mark on them, whether they are trustworthy or not. Because there's really no need to conceal one's intent if one's intent is pure. So he's likely to look for fast, easy, self-serving gains without the proper efforts if there is something to conceal, right? So for practicality of these discussions, let's consider a couple of scenarios. Let's say a person comes into a temple and asks the masters for help. He says, the COVID-19 situation is killing business. Sifu, masters, I need your help. Then the master puts his hand over that person's head and recites some mantra. The master then prays to the Buddhas in the main hall and recites some sutras. Moments later, the master comes out and talks to that person who has been waiting in the lecture hall waiting for the master to complete the recitations. And the master says, I have dedicated the merits to you for you to overcome your difficulties. But you must remember to do good deeds to repay. And so that person understands and leaves, thanking the master for his help and his teaching. So let me ask you, is this proper or improper? Can somebody type on the chat? What do you think? Is this proper or improper? Well, depends on how you look at it. It could be proper because the masters understands the level of understanding of Buddhism of that person. So this person apparently needs help. But where it is proper is that he has done some merits to dedicate to that person. But the underlining is here. That he encourages that person to do good deeds to repay. So if it turns out that person is now able to overcome his difficulties, then one explanation is that perhaps Buddhas or Bodhisattvas has lent him their merits to help him overcome difficulties. So in other words, he has borrowed the merits of the Buddhas or Bodhisattvas to overcome his difficulties. But he must do good deeds to repay. And so that is why sometimes when we do good deeds and we continue to encounter difficulties, and it seems like there's no law of cause and effect, because we continue to help people, but at the same time we continue to encounter hardships. And that is because in the past perhaps we owe too much, or we ask for Buddha's help way too much, other people's help way too much. And now because we owe so much, that when we do good deeds, we are repaying all the good deeds and we're not reaping the benefits. But at least we're not encountering starvations or dire situations, or lose our lives, life-threatening situations. But if we owe a lot, then of course when we do good deeds, we will shrink that debt. And because we can maintain a life, but we won't be wealthy, spiritually wealthy, right, or financially wealthy. And so don't be discouraged when we do good deeds and good deeds don't come to us. We should understand that we owe way too much. In the past, for example, we drive around and we're looking for a parking lot and we pray to the Buddha, please Buddha, let me find a parking space. Something trivial like that, we still pray for the Buddha to help us. Of course, our compassion with credit, we of course have to have some credit in order to have that loan. Then perhaps somebody, maybe not the Buddha, but some heaven beings, whatnot, helps us to find a parking space, very convenient parking space. We don't have to walk too far. Of course, in that help, you have just owe that person, that being, some karmic debt. Of course, next time that you do good deeds, that debt has to be repaid with your good deeds. And therefore, you may not encounter success right away or fortune right away. So because that needs to be balanced. Okay, second scenario, same situation. So the person runs into the temple and says to the masters, I need help. And so the master says, I can give you this magic spell to make you successful. As long as you worship me and you make offerings to me, I will protect you from any kind of financial disasters. Well, this is not proper, of course, because he's not teaching that person to be responsible for his or her own action. Right? So, but to rely on that master solely to avoid disaster, so that is improper. But without understanding causality, in the times of uncertainty, it is very easy to make mistakes, to have selfish cravings, self-centered motivations. And when we make mistakes, it's very easy to blame others because we take no responsibility, because we don't understand the law of cause and effect. And of course, that will only increase our delusion, right? Okay, so those are teachings. And then the third teachings here is that we can use to decide for ourselves, to help us determine whether it is proper or not proper. It's the principle of no self. So in the past, when the Buddha was still on earth, he had met many great gurus who had made tremendous achievements. But because they didn't understand the principle of no self completely, that the Buddha had to move on to attain his own, because he could not find a person, any guru, who had achieved the state of no self. So, of course, as history would tell us, he later achieved the state of no self and was liberated from the samsara, the cycle of life and death. And of course, he helped others to achieve the same. Should the teaching encourage us to be proud and be arrogant of our own accomplishments? then that is inconsistent with the principle of no self. That is the principle that the Buddha taught us. For example, let's say a master says to a student, I have a very special method to help you to make great achievements in a very short period of time. And if you follow me, you will surpass all your peers studying with other masters. By 20 years, you're leaping ahead by 20 years because I see the good roots in you. You have good roots for learning. So is this proper or improper? Any guess? Any quick comments on the chat there? What do you think? Well, from this perspective, this may be improper because the master is inflating the ego of the student, saying that he has good roots and that he can make great achievements. But if he's not careful in balancing that, he could make that student to be very arrogant. But of course, in saying that to encourage a student, depending on the student's ability, the teachers, the master should also encourage a student to put in effort and to put in hard work to achieve that, and to observe humbleness, as opposed to focusing on the good roots. Because if he only knows his good roots, and if he's a very talented student and he achieves something, the teachings very easily, then he would not appreciate the hard work behind it. And he will think that all things will come to him very easily. And there is no need for hard work. There's no need for diligence. And so when he encounters difficulties, it makes it very difficult for him to overcome that. And he could encounter depression. Just like when we are children, when we discipline our children and we pamper them too much, we may inflate their self-confidence, self-esteem, but if we're not careful, we could hurt them because they think that the world will love them, will tolerate their mischievousness, and they will tolerate their improper behavior, just like their parents. And whatever they do, that will be complimented. Then it is very dangerous because as a person grows up, goes into the workforce, that person cannot behave that way. That child would have, is now an adult, would have to follow the rules of the proper conduct of the company. If he doesn't perform, of course, he will be evaluated poorly, and therefore he could lose his job. And so not recognizing and appreciating the hard work can easily lead to arrogance. Okay. So here, what we talked about is, okay, then the Buddha says here, continuing the discussions in the sutra, the blind man suddenly recovers his sight. Let's say that the blind man recovers his sight and sees everything clearly. If you say that it is his eyes which see, then a man who saw darkness in the room suddenly lights a lamp which enables him to see. You should say that it is the lamp that sees, right? If it's the eyes that sees, if his eye recovers, then it would be the same as the lamp lighting up the room, and that person that can see, so it would be the lamp that sees. But of course, that's not the case because the lamp cannot see. It's an animate object. If it really sees, then it has no relation to you. In other words, if your eyes can see independently, then it is independent of you and has no relation to you. You should know that while the lamp can reveal form, seeing comes from the eyes, but not from the lamp. Right? So in other words, our seeing is really not from our seeing sight consciousness. While your eyes can reveal form, the nature of seeing comes from the mind, not from the eyes. Okay, so we have a few minutes here. Let's wrap this up. So let's expand on this a little bit more. So the seeing actually comes from sense consciousness, as we've learned. Just because you have eyes doesn't mean you can see, right? For example, your eyes are wide open, you're driving down the street, but you cannot see the car in front of you, therefore you run into that car, although your eyes are wide open, but you cannot truly see it because there's no consciousness then in there, you're not paying attention. So eyes are just sensing tools to detect objects. It's the sense consciousness that can recognize objects and situations around them. So the more consciousness is refined, the clearer it can see. So for example, let's make it more practical. So for example, like you can see that no clue, a person cannot see anything, and there's some data, and then from that data you generate information, and from information you generate insight. Well, you have tons of data, right? And that's valuable. For example, like to us, it's not very valuable because we don't know what to do with the data. But to Google and other companies, data is so important because it's data that they can derive information. But only a company with very powerful tool, very sophisticated software applications to able to extract insight from that information to determine the trend and what people like so that they can design products to meet that desire. Just like Apple, right? They understand, they have insight into the information that they have, the design data, the design, the engineering, materials, all those things that are available, but they have the insight to understand how to make desirable computers, objects. So like just like an analogy that so analogy is no clue, like no data, like a blind person not seeing anything, right? Just like a blank graph, you don't see anything, doesn't mean anything, it's just a blank graph. But when you have some data, we have some data, you have at least something, but you don't know what's all these points all over the place. You don't know what this means. But if from data, you can extract information from it. And when you start to see, you can scale it now. Right? You see where things are better than before. But with insight, well, now you can start seeing a trend. Although things seem to be random, but if you have insight, you can see that there is a trend in that information. And what insight is like wisdom. Insight is like when you look down into the pond, you see the fish clearly, which ones are swimming what direction, you know exactly where things are. And with insight, with wisdom, it's like seeing from above. People crossing with Buddha, within wisdom, like Buddha can see people crossing, traversing the 6 realms from hell up to heaven, up and down, and know exactly where they're going. With insight, it is like a bird's eye view where you look and you see where things are very clearly. So knowing clearly, without a doubt, what's wrong, what's right, what's good, what's bad, what's skillful and what's unskillful, that is insight. So because we see people doing things, good, bad, some people hurt others, some people help others, but we don't have insight, meaning we don't see the result of good deeds, bad deeds, and therefore we will not be motivated to do those things because you don't understand the good, the harmful, the suffering, the joy behind it. Therefore, you won't be committed to doing something very skillful to help yourself. Okay. So expanding this a little bit more, for the last few minutes here we have left. No clue is like a person aimlessly living a life without any sense of direction or purpose. Partying all day, not being responsible for himself or herself or others, right? And even that person may become a burden to society. And of course, the price is suffering. With data, that person starts to recognize, I don't want hardships in life. I don't want poverty. I want to have some, to avoid hardships. So therefore, I get an education, I get a job, and become more self-conscious, the needs of the self. and therefore a person has reduced affliction and avoid suffering. What information is like a person now being a responsible person, raising a good family, very conscious of self and others, but very in a limited scope. He is a very good person, but within the realm of the circle of his family, for example. So that is self-liberation in a very self-centered kind of focus. So there'll be there'll be minimal afflictions because at least he has a happy family, circle of family, friends, relatives that will take care of each other. Insight, of course, is to break that boundary of our circle of friends and family, but to include all sentient beings. And that is the state of being of bodhisattvas and Buddhas. They see sufferings and therefore they seek suffering, but at the same time when they see others suffering in the samsara, they cause rise to compassion and help others to be liberated from suffering of birth, old age, illness, and death. And not only helping themselves, but helping others, enable others to help themselves and to help others. So therefore, there is no afflictions, because of this insight, wisdom, that they don't have afflictions. Doesn't mean they don't have difficulties. They have difficulties, but to them it's natural. To them it's nothing. It's just a math problem they have to solve, but they know how to solve the problem, so there is no difficulty in solving the problems. It doesn't mean that they don't do anything. A person who has insight, who has wisdom, who has achieved spiritual liberation, doesn't mean that they don't encounter difficult people. But to them, encountering difficult people is very natural. It's just like encountering good people, because they understand conditionality and there is no afflictions. Does it make sense? So here's that the Buddha is explaining to Ananda the falseness of the sixth sense. That sense consciousness arises because of data and because of the sense organs, and the ego is delusional. When we should try our best to suppress that ego, and it is through understanding Buddhism, the Dharma, and in order to be convinced, to have self-confidence that compassion, selfless giving is great, it's beneficial, and that we should have utmost respect for the great teachers, because he was so compassionate to come to earth to encounter all kinds of difficulties, but really no difficulties at all to him, as we just explained. But he has given us great motivation to achieve something that it is possible. All right? So that will complete our discussions on the mind, and we'll continue on the other elements of reality next time we meet. All right. If there are no comments, if you have comments later, you can always drop me an email. I'll put the chat will go away after we end streaming, but should there be any comments later on, you can drop me an email. All right, let's do merit dedication. Please join your palms. Together we recite here. May the merits and virtues accrue today adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the paths below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss. Amida. We will see you next time.